The idea that the Chinese control the Panama Canal is absurd. And so this kind of goes full circle back to how earnest locals feel the need to tell me when I'm in a taxi that our president is saying things that simply aren't true.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Donald Trump is serious about his intention to seize the Panama Canal. He discussed it in his inauguration address and has dispatched Secretary of State Marco Rubio to Panama to put a plan in motion. But what do Panamanians think about this? My interview guest is Ed Price, a political economist at New York University and columnist for the Financial Times. We begin by discussing the general mood on the streets of Panama City before turning to a broader conversation about how political and policy elites in Panama are responding to this assault on their sovereignty. We also examine the wider geopolitical implications of Trump's ambitions for territorial expansion, including annexing the Panama Canal, acquiring Greenland, and making Canada the, quote, 51st state. We recorded our conversation live via Substack. If you'd like to join any of these conversations live as they are happening, please just subscribe to Global Dispatches at globaldispatches.org. And while you are there, you can also get a paying subscription to support the work that we do. I really rely on your support to keep this show going, so thank you for supporting Global Dispatches with your paying subscription. It means a lot. Now, here is my conversation with Ed Price. I should just say from the outset that one of my favorite things about the show that I've now done for over 13 years is that the audience that congregates around it are experts themselves. It really is like a policy audience that congregates around Global Dispatches. And I love nothing more than when audience members become guests because you all are interesting and expert people. So Ed, where are you right now?
So Mark, thanks for asking. I am in Panama City, and I'm here doing what I have a tendency to do, which is get up in the morning, read the news, realize I really don't understand what's going on, and if I can, get on a plane and go places and ask people things. And that's what I'm doing down here. I'm just walking around asking locals, very often in English, by the way, so before anyone thinks I'm a fluent Spanish speaker, I'm very much not, which has been demonstrated on this trip, but just asking people what they think about the obvious news coming out of the US.
So I've been wanting to do an episode that takes the perspective of Panama from Panamanians. So before we dive into the details and the history and the politics of this all, what's just the mood on the street, like the vibe? Like, what are you hearing from the Panamanians, presumably more in the policy community, that you've been speaking with over the last, few days?
I've been trying to put my finger on exactly what the mood is, and I've been scratching my head. And I realized a few hours ago that it feels like a visit to Ukraine because people feel pretty pressured, and they're telling me so. So I'll give you an example. I got out at the airport. I mean, I'm obviously a gringo, right? Got into a taxi, and the taxi driver established very quickly that I was living in and from the United States of America, and I'm an American citizen. And this was remarkable, began to list what he perceives to be the lies that our president has told about his country going back to whenever and right up to current today, including listing that there were no 38,000 American casualties during the American building of the canal, saying that, Donald Trump is out of order to be speaking like this, and telling me that there's no Chinese control of the canal. And I found that pretty remarkable because I'm here as a tourist, effectively, and this very well-informed taxi driver wants to set me straight. Sort of the punchline to this, the sorry punchline, is that the United States now seems to be perceived as a source of disinformation, such that people feel the need to correct tourists when they get into taxis.
I mean, that's an anecdote, the classic, taxi driver anecdote. What about the more policy-oriented people that you've been speaking with? Like, how concerned are they for their territorial integrity and Panamanian sovereignty right now?
So I think it's a double-edged sword in the sense that the international policy community, all of those of us who were trained or educated in any way to administer globalization, find this stuff quite hard to believe. And they're usually quite diplomatic. People are usually quite polite, and they usually have a demeanor about them that isn't alarmist. But at the same time, of course, Panama has a history of strife and invasion and a dictatorship. And so there's no local that I've spoken to here that ultimately in the back of their mind, or indeed at the front of their mind, isn't taking this sufficiently seriously that they are expressing serious concerns. Again, I'm surprised at how polite everybody is, because I'll sort of, clear my throat and raise this issue. You'd imagine that someone might raise their voice or shout at me. I'm effectively a Yankee, right? But no, they're very polite, they're very firm, and anyone and everyone that I've talked with is feeling a deep level of uncertainty. Apparently, the president of Panama has not yet addressed the nation on this issue, but people are anecdotally expecting that he will at some point.
I mean, that's interesting what you said about the recent history of Panama, which in most Panamanians' lifetime, they've known an extensive degree of political strife, of dictatorship. Things have been calm, and it is like a multi-party democracy today. But I suppose what I'm hearing from you is that this exogenous odd threat from the Trump administration might upend what has been a period of stability in Panama.
I think it might. I mean, it depends exactly what President Trump intends to do or will do. The 1977 treaties, right, with Carter are very well celebrated. They're mentioned everywhere. There are billboards. And, again, local citizens will know in detail what these treaties hold, including the neutrality provisions. But of course, there's also the 1989 invasion that's in people's minds. And so Panama has this dualistic nature a lot of the time when you're walking around, in the sense that there's great wealth, right? There's commerce, and there's the canal, of course, and high rises. But there's also an element of the past, maybe, that's damaged Panama. And so in some ways, it's like Chile. Chile is somewhere else that you'll go and you'll see wealth and you'll see stability today, but never far in the background, Noriega, Pinochet, these characters, perhaps Castro in Cuba, they're around and they're in the minds of people here today because they don't know which way their history is about to go.
You mentioned the 1977 treaty. This is now on top of everyone's minds suddenly. Could you just, not in any super granular detail, but big picture, describe for listeners what this treaty obliges of the United States and of Panama?
So it's actually two treaties. It's very simple. The treaties were, on the one hand, that the United States would give back the control of the canal zone, the area around the canal and the canal itself, to Panama. And that process was complete in the late 1990s when Panama took sole possession. And that's done. So we've done and dusted that. The other part of the treaty is to maintain the neutrality of the Panama Canal. This was probably smart, right, on the part of Americans to insert this back in the day, because it's a sort of get out of jail free card if we ever have to come back. And it essentially says that the United States has the right militarily to go back to Panama if there's some sort of threat to Panama's neutrality. So that's the neutrality treaty. This sort of leads into what Donald Trump is saying today, right? Because I'm not clear exactly what he's saying and what he means when he says, let's take it back. Does he mean that we want to, sail our navy down to Panama and poke around and see if there are any foreign powers? Maybe. Or does he mean that it's the first part of those treaties, i.e. controlling the Panama Zone Canal itself? That's not clear to me. I don't think it's clear to the locals either.
On the canal itself, could you just describe how it works and what the mechanics of the canal are? Because as I understand it, a lot of the discussion, the concern expressed by the Trump administration, whether reflected in reality or not, has to do with transit fees. And he thinks the American companies and maybe even the US military is paying more than it ought to. Like how, just from like a logistical and technical standpoint, does the canal operate on a day-to-day basis and generate revenues? And who collects those revenues?
Right, so it's the Panama Canal Authority that basically effectively owns the canal, and that's the Panamanian government. And I think right off the top, the first point is that the canal and Panama, the country, and the sovereignty of Panama and the commerce of Panama are effectively the same thing. I've never seen such a concentrated fungibility between GDP, sovereignty, and the rule of law in one small place. And that is to say that if we did take it back, we would effectively be conquering Panama. The actual organization of the canal, some of this is engineering, right? The French tried it. We can go away and look at that history, maybe outside of this Substack. The Americans then came along with a bright idea and said, well, why don't we flood a whole part of this area and create locks? And today, Panama effectively makes most of its national revenue from the transit of cargo, right? So it's a commercial operation. Reading around this, because I was asking myself the same question, I can't see that the US government pays more than $1 million a year, something like that, anyway, to the canal, the government vessels, which, I mean, fact check me on that, but this is the best figure I can find.
I actually have seen a very similar figure to that. It's a very low fee that US government, mostly military vessels, would pay. It's in like about $1 million.
It's about $1 million, which I mean is big money for me, but I'm sort of, chump change for Uncle Sam. The other point to make maybe is that one thing that we forget as Americans is that, sure, the Americans helped the Panamanians become sovereign in 1903. They were a protectorate until 1939. We built the canal and so on. But in 2007 and 2016, and between those 2 years, the Panamanians actually expanded the canal themselves, such that there's 3 times more cargo going through this thing every year. So, we shouldn't forget that the Panamanians are not bystanders in this whole thing. They've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the canal themselves.
One geopolitical aspect that has come to the fore about the Panama Canal has been the claims that, the Chinese government or the Chinese companies have like an undue influence over ports and port access around the canal. And I know just recently BlackRock, an American company, is involved in the purchase of many of these claims from a Chinese consortium that owns a number of ports around the canal. I guess 2 sort of separate but similar questions. What are sort of Chinese interests, such as they exist, in the Panama Canal? And how do you interpret this move by BlackRock to purchase much more of the ports and the infrastructure around the canal?
So this is speculation. I don't think that Chinese interests in the canal are anywhere where they would like them to be, or anything enough that the Trump administration is on solid ground making the claim that China controls the canal. I mean, that's just an outright falsehood. Hutchison, which is a Hong Kong-based firm owned by Li Ka-shing, who's one of the world's richest men, right? Good for him, did have some interest that BlackRock is in the process of purchasing. And again, my understanding, speculatively, is that BlackRock was maybe encouraged in this direction by the current climate that the White House is creating. But the idea that the Chinese control the Panama Canal is absurd. And so this kind of goes full circle back to how earnest locals feel the need to tell me when I'm in a taxi that our president is saying things that simply aren't true. Is it the case that China is one of the major users of the canal? Yes. Does China benefit commercially? Yes. And is there a sort of tail risk scenario in which a foreign power could, seize the canal and defend the canal? I'm sure, right? As things stand, neither commercially nor strategically, China do not control the canal. The canal is controlled by Panama.
You've kind of described the mood on the street and your conversations with policy officials and policy people. What has been like an official response by the government? You mentioned Molina, the president, hasn't like addressed the nation on this topic, but what have their interactions been with US officials? For example, Marco Rubio. So like, what has been the tone and tenor of like official government to government diplomacy on this question, on this issue?
So the Panamanians, I think, rightly have been very strongly against this. And the Secretary of State Rubio did visit in January. I think 2 points spring to mind in terms of the response from Panama. One is that Panamanian officials have made reference to UN Charter Article 2, which effectively forbids the gaze of foreign powers and threats against territories and so on. So they're looking at this as potentially invasion.
Yeah, I mean it's like an explicit piece of the UN Charter, which is international law, saying you can't threaten to invade another country and take their territory. It's sort of written very directly in there. And I have seen around the UN the Panamanians try to raise this concern, which apparently is very legitimate.
I mean, as an aside, it's like at home when Trump supporters say, well, he's only kidding when he says this stuff. I mean, you and I don't have a right to go up to someone in a bar and say, I'm going to bash your brains in and take your wallet. I'm only kidding. So, of course, Panama has to take these utterances seriously. The other thing that really stuck in my mind was a phrase that the president himself used, Molino. He said, an affront to the truth and our national dignity, to describe Trump's threats. And that really stuck in my mind because I thought, crikey, it's also an affront to our national dignity as Americans that we would be brazenly suggesting the conquest of friends and allies. And again, these are treaty partners, the treaties that we've signed and that we really should uphold. So the Panamanian response diplomatically has been very strong, understandably so. But I think they're also probably walking a fine line because they know that if they say anything that's considered too aggressive from the Trump administration, that could be something that officials jump on and say, well, look, these guys aren't our friends. This is exactly why we need to go in anyway.
So I know you're in Panama only briefly to get a kind of on the ground understanding of how Trump's threats to seize the Panama Canal are playing out locally. But your day job is as a geopolitical analyst and assessor of international affairs, big picture. What are some of the bigger picture geopolitical implications of Trump's messaging, at least right now, on the Panama Canal?
So it's a really good question, Mark, and I'm puzzling over it daily. This is my take, okay? Trump saying that the United States will take Panama is very similar to Trump saying we'll take Canada and Greenland. I think that message is essentially what we want is a North American strategic autarky in which we have our zone of influence back to the 19th century. And effectively, we are expanding the Monroe Doctrine north and we are enforcing the Monroe Doctrine in the South, such that the Americas themselves belong to Washington, D.C. One effect of that, apart from making people like me feel like they're taking crazy pills, is that in Moscow and Beijing, they might think that that's a signal to them that they also have their spheres of influence. And so I think that just as the Panama Canal is a local issue, it's also important in Kyiv, and it's also important in Tokyo and in Taiwan, Taipei City, because our democratic allies will be looking at this stuff and once again assessing whether or not only is the United States a reliable partner, but whether the United States is perhaps an aggressor, which is also a very disturbing thing to hear oneself say. So I think it's a global effect.
Yeah, I think by now people understand that Trump isn't joking or speaking off the cuff when he refers to Canada as the 51st state, where he muses about acquiring Greenland and Panama. These are not like jokes. I think maybe at first people would kind of scoff at them and laugh them off, but there is mounting evidence to suggest that he's deeply serious about these intentions. And what you say about what that signals to other countries around the world is really interesting. I mean, for most of the last 10 years, a lot of the geopolitical security discourse in DC has been around, how do we defend Taiwan from China's territorial ambitions? And I see your point when you say that Trump's own ambitions for Canada, for Greenland, and for Panama make confronting some of those other threats more difficult potentially.
I think so, because, traditionally the way that we defended Taiwan was strategic ambiguity. And in Biden's presidency, he mentioned, and was quickly talked back by the State Department, but he mentioned quite clearly that we might defend them. But Trump is moving in the opposite direction. And, Mark, you understand this stuff better than I do, but these utterances made by statesmen are difficult to ascertain for their ultimate effect. Before the First World War, we had deterrence between two armed camps. That didn't stop a war. Before the Second World War, one camp was ahead of the other. That didn't stop a war. And I don't honestly know that whether Trump's behavior is taken seriously in Beijing or not. It makes a Taiwan invasion more or less serious. All I can tell you is that the only way I think the Chinese would really go for it is if they knew that Trump would do nothing.
On the Panama question specifically, in the coming weeks or months, are there any indicators or inflection points that will suggest to you where this story may evolve? Like, what are you looking towards, either from Panama or from the White House?
So I'm really interested in test balloons. I'm really interested in the administration doing things that it thinks it can pull out of if it needs to, but that if it gets away with it, might be able to go a bit further. So, for example, do I think that the United States would annex Greenland, Canada, and Panama on the same day? Probably not, right? That's like blitzkrieg stuff. But would it be the case that a judge's order or two is defied, maybe a few more troops appear in Greenland, maybe there's a show of force around the coasts around Panama, some such like that? Those are the sorts of things that I, as an analyst, look for, because I have to hand it to this White House. It's organized. It's intelligent in the sense that what it's doing is cogent. Whether you agree with it or not is another matter. So I don't think that this is a bumbling White House by any means. I think it's quite determined and quite organized. And the sensible thing to do if you really wanted to start to, ratchet up the pressure on a foreign country is, as Trump has been doing, right? He sort of says, well, what about this level of tariff, 25%, 50%, 25%? And that's what I mean by a test balloon, seeing how far you can get away with certain things. And that's maybe stage one. And then the full annexation would have to be later on, stage two, stage three. Because again, you have to explain these things even to your own supporters, right?
I mean, it's disturbing to think that U.S. boots on the ground to enforce American control over the Panama Canal zone is not out of the realm of possibility right now. I mean, it might seem remote at the moment, but it's not hugely remote the way things seem to be going.
It's not remote here either. And the invasion of 1989 is often in people's minds and on their lips. So that's really recent history. And just as we remember 1989, 1990, 1991 as the peak of our global power, down here in Panama, 1989 is an invasion. You go through the museums, there's a very strong view that it was a good thing because it was a liberation in some ways. There's also a very strong view that it was a bad thing because of the civilian death and suffering that it invariably caused. So it does seem strange. And I was on Bloomberg just the other day saying that I think Trump's Canada plans are serious. It feels strange to say these things, but I think that we would be insufficient as analysts if we didn't speak honestly and say, that does look like the White House has serious plans, as per the inaugural address, to add to the territory of the United States.
Ed, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of you who are joining us live. I so appreciate it. If you are not already a paid subscriber to Global Dispatches, please help me keep doing what I do by upgrading your subscription. Thank you. I really do rely and frankly require paid subscriptions to keep this show and keep this Substack going. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.